Jewish Channel's Week in Review. Qaddafi under bombardment while Israel suffers from terror. How will both play out on the world stage? Singles gather trying to make some matches, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Global news headlines over the past week have focused strongly on the Mideast, starting with the terrorist attacks in Israel and continuing with the situation in Libya. The connections between terrorism in Israel and revolution in Libya mean that Israeli security is a significant question in the months ahead. Starting with the terrorist attacks in Israel, at least 7 Israeli civilians and 1 Israeli soldier were killed, with at least 29 wounded as a result of 5 coordinated attacks in southern Israel. The attacks included the launching of rockets from Gaza, a suicide bombing, and gunfire. To engage in some of the attacks, terrorists gained access to Israel by way of Egypt. Lax border security in Egypt has been a major point of concern for Israel in the months since the resignation of former dictator Hosni Mubarak, a concern that's now been realized with these attacks. This led to a somewhat different statement from the United States and Europe than we've seen in the past in response to terrorist attacks. The statement from the so-called Quartet of Nations advising on the Israeli-Palestinian situation condemned the attacks and called for restraint on all sides, which often happens. However, the quartet this time added expressions of concern over security in the border Israel shares with Egypt. The quartet also expresses its concern about the security situation in the Sinai Peninsula, said the statement, adding, "Recent commitments by the Egyptian government to address the security situation in the Sinai are important, and the quartet encourages the Egyptian government to find a lasting resolution to the issue of Sinai security." This statement speaks to a Western concern about the so-called Arab Spring overall, and what's referred to as the devil that you know approach to foreign policy, in which the stability represented by brutal dictators like Hosni Mubarak and Muammar Qaddafi is being replaced by something somewhat less stable, particularly as regards Israeli security. Much of the news out of Egypt in recent months has suggested a strengthening of Islamic attitudes in governance there is coming. Israel also faces a specific diplomatic crisis as a result of the terror attacks last week, because several Egyptian soldiers were killed, perhaps as a result of Israeli gunfire. Moving on to Libya, where the Qaddafi regime was not quite deposed but clearly on its heels as we went to broadcast. While it's hard to imagine a Libyan government that could be more antagonistic to Israel than the Qaddafi regime has been, early anecdotal news out of that country points in 2 directions. On the one hand, the Libyan draft constitution suggests that American-style democracy is clearly not the rebels' goal. Part 1, Article 1 states rather plainly, Islam is the religion of the state and the principal source of legislation in Islamic jurisprudence or Sharia. Of course, a state's being Islamic in nature hasn't always meant it will be antagonistic to Israel or Jews. One sign that Libya could be more friendly to Jews than most comes in another piece of news, that the rebels are making a specific effort to have Libyan Jews be part of the future government. The head of a Jewish Libyans group in England told the Jerusalem Post he's been invited back to Libya personally by opposition leader Mustafa Abdul Jalil. The expatriate Jewish leader, Rafal Luzon, told the Jerusalem Post, quote, "A week ago I received an invitation from the chief of the rebels. They proposed for me to take part in one of the parties because they would like it to be open to all people, including women and Jews." Luzon, whose family fled Libya in 1967 amid a pogrom in the country, said he's going to wait to see what the democratic nature of the government in Libya turns out to be before deciding whether or not to return and take part in its politics. He expressed these mixed sentiments of optimism and concern in saying, quote, "If I do it for one matter, the historical matter, the first Arab country that proposed that a Jew run in a free election." Like in Libya, early signs in Egypt had also pointed to hopes of minority leadership, and a Christian mayor was actually elected in one Egyptian town. But after the Christian mayor's election in Egypt, riots ensued. It remains to be seen whether the Libyan revolutionary leaders can keep in sync with the average citizen there in pushing forward a pluralist agenda. Shifting back to the attacks against Israel, setting Egypt and Libya aside, the actual source of danger is obviously Hamas, which controls Gaza, from where the attacks were initiated. Aside from the attacks of August 18th, there have also been approximately 100 rockets launched into Israel from Gaza since that day. One hit a school in Beersheba on Sunday, but the building was empty as school won't resume in Israel for another 2 weeks. Though there have been repeated announcements of ceasefires and/or truces in the past week, Hamas has consistently continued the rocket attacks, sometimes with an announcement that the ceasefire or truce is over, and sometimes without any announcement. Israeli forces continued to respond with airstrikes. Going from Israel's security concerns to Israel's domestic economic concerns, as we've mentioned in recent weeks, a relatively peaceful time had allowed massive economic protests to become the big story out of Israel for some time. With last week's attacks, economic news in Israel is again being pushed back, and in a convergence of headline reality with actual reality, the latest protest was quickly shut down. Dozens of Israeli protesters were evicted this week from an abandoned building in which they'd been squatting for less than 24 hours. The building had been abandoned for a decade, and the protesters were calling for the, quote, return of this asset to the public. And while Israelis are protesting over the ability to house their families, here in the United States, many single people in the Jewish community are trying to figure out how to make families in the first place. Christian Needham reports on the Jewish Night of Love and one massive party.
Hundreds of young Jewish singles gathered on the Upper West Side this past week for Jewish comedy website BangItOut.com's 10th annual Tu B'Av White Party. The event looks to connect Jewish singles face-to-face, and TJC heard from website and party co-founder Isaac Galina about the evolution of the event.
It's really one of the most successful events in the Upper West Side. People are thrilled about it, and it always seems to be a really interesting crowd of people, a variety of different Jewish people from around the tri-state area all coming out wearing white and living it up a little bit, trying something new. It's definitely not your ordinary party. You have these absurd stickers, but people had the vibe that they really actually want to make things happen tonight.
TJC has covered these nighttime parties the last several years during a period when romantic introductions have become more and more of an online affair, with Jewish-centric dating sites like JDate having large appeal for those who have a tough time making face-to-face introductions at events like this one.
Online dating, I'm a huge fan. If it works for people, great. If it doesn't work for people, we're trying to create an alternative. And to be honest with you, there are not that many that exist that are legitimately we're here strictly to, date each other, get married, have families. And we value that. And I think bringing it offline and face-to-face and real people hanging out with real other people, it takes away the kind of nonsense that's in the online dating world.
That alternative appealed to this Jewish single, who said she liked the easy atmosphere Galina has honed over the 10 years of this meetup event, and that this was her second year in a row attending it.
I guess it's just a great way to meet people, more casual, rather than going online or other events. It's just really laid back, it's outside, and if you find someone great, and if you walk away with a friend or two, even better.
Galina said the religious diversity of attendees also makes this Tu B'Av event unique.
I would ballpark it at 50% coming from a modern Orthodox yeshiva day school type of background, and the other 50% coming from a completely arbitrary background, whether it's completely secular or Haredi. We really kind of open the door to anyone, and it is a little absurd that we get that type of spectrum, but it also makes it a much more diverse crowd.
I guess the diversity is the positive aspect because it kind of opens up the door for more opportunities. It's not so good to be narrow-minded.
Galina friend Jason Finkelstein, who's married but was at the event more for the beverages and people watching, commented on how little the Upper West Side dating scene has changed since he was single.
Unfortunately, it hasn't changed much. I think that there's too much going on in New York. And I know that, if you think that I have more options and you're always looking for the next big thing, you're going to miss out on what's right in front of you.
Galina added that the sunset view of the Hudson River might not be exactly like the biblical vineyards that inspired Tu B'Av, but the convenience can't be beat.
Well, it definitely, it definitely fulfills some sort of biblical. We don't have vineyards here in New York City necessarily. And if we would have done it in Central Park, we'd have done other stuff in there. This just makes it so accessible to the Upper West Side. It's easy. It's fairly reasonably priced for anyone and everyone to come in, enjoy themselves, and walk home. They don't have to spend money on a cab or schlep 40 minutes to someplace in the village.
Reporting from the Upper West Side for the Jewish Channel, I'm Christian Needham.
Thank you, Christian. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 291, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and now on Comcast Cable in the on-demand menu under Premium Channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.